When widower Samuel Garrett swore on his wife's grave that he'd never love again, he thought his heart was buried forever beneath the Nebraska prairie until a crying woman stepped off the 3:15 train and shattered 3 years of carefully constructed solitude with a single desperate glance. But in a frontier town, where scandal can destroy lives and second chances are as rare as spring rain, can two broken souls find the courage to rebuild what they've lost? The train whistle cut through the October air like a knife through butter, making Samuel Garrett's hand shake as he stood on the wooden platform. His boots scraped against the rough boards while he waited for the 3:15 from Omaha to arrive in Millbrook Station. The Nebraska Territory stretched out behind him like a golden ocean, and the year 1867 had brought nothing but empty days since Catherine died. Samuel pulled his pocket watch from his vest and flipped it open. The tiny photograph inside showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. 3 years, 2 months, and 15 days, he whispered to the picture. That's how long it had been since fever took his wife away and left him alone on their homestead. The ground under his feet began to rumble. Black smoke appeared on the horizon, growing bigger by the second. Samuel snapped the watch closed and shoved it back into his pocket. He came to town every few weeks to pick up supplies, but today felt different somehow. The air seemed to buzz with electricity, like right before a thunderstorm. "All aboard!" The conductor's voice boomed across the prairie even though the train was still a mile away. Samuel could see it now, chugging toward the station like a metal beast breathing fire and steam. The locomotive's headlight gleamed in the afternoon sun, and its whistle screamed again, making the windows of the nearby buildings rattle. Other people started gathering on the platform. Old Pete from the general store hobbled over with his cane, probably expecting a shipment of goods. Mrs. Murphy clutched her shawl tight around her shoulders as she scanned the approaching train, looking for her nephew, who was supposed to visit from back east. Doc Harrison stood near the depot office, his black medical bag in hand, ready to help anyone who might need it. Samuel tried to focus on his mental list of supplies. He needed flour, salt, coffee beans, and lamp oil to get through the coming winter. But his mind kept wandering to the empty house, waiting for him 5 miles outside town. The silence there had grown so thick he could almost touch it. Sometimes he talked to the chickens just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. The train rounded the last bend, and Samuel could see the individual cars now. The engine puffed and wheezed as it began to slow down. Steam shot out from the sides like dragon's breath, and the brakes started making that awful screeching sound that always made his teeth hurt. The whole platform shook under his feet as tons of iron and steel came to a stop. "Millbrook Station!" the conductor yelled, even though everyone could see exactly where they were. The doors of the passenger cars swung open, and people began climbing down onto the platform. Samuel watched them with the same detached interest he watched everything these days, like he was looking at the world through thick glass. A businessman in a fancy suit stepped down first, checking his gold pocket watch and looking around with obvious disappointment. Behind him came a family with 3 small children, the mother trying to keep them all together, while the father wrestled with their luggage. An elderly woman in black moved slowly down the steps, probably coming to visit relatives, or maybe to stay permanently with family who could take care of her. But then Samuel saw movement at the back of the train that made his breath catch in his throat. A woman appeared in the doorway of the last passenger car, and even from a distance, he could see that something was terribly wrong. Her shoulders shook like she was crying, and she seemed to be having trouble deciding whether to step down or stay on the train. The woman wore a dark blue dress that looked expensive but was covered in dust from the journey. Her reddish-brown hair had come loose from its pins and blew around her face in the prairie wind. She held a small leather bag in one hand and pressed the other against her mouth, like she was trying to hold back sobs. Samuel found himself walking toward her before he realized what he was doing. His boots carried him across the platform without any conscious decision on his part. The woman looked up as he approached, and he saw tears streaming down her face. Her eyes were green as spring grass, but they held a sadness so deep it made his chest ache. "Ma'am?" The word came out rougher than he intended. "Are you all right?" She stared at him for a moment, and Samuel felt like she was looking right through him to something he couldn't see. Then she shook her head, and more tears fell. "I don't know," she whispered. "I truly don't know." The woman's voice trembled like a leaf in a storm, and Samuel felt something inside his chest crack open for the first time in 3 years. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but the tears kept coming anyway. Her small leather bag slipped from her grip and hit the platform with a soft thud. "I'm sorry," she said, bending to pick up the bag. "I don't usually fall apart in front of strangers. I'm Eleanor Brennan, and I've made a terrible mistake coming here." Samuel removed his hat, a gesture Catherine had taught him was proper when speaking to a lady. "Samuel Garrett, ma'am. What kind of mistake?" Eleanor pulled a crumpled yellow paper from her bag. Her hands shook as she held it out to him. "I came here to teach at the schoolhouse. I had a contract and everything. But this telegram arrived this morning at my hotel in Omaha." Samuel took the paper and read it quickly. The message was short and cruel. "Position filled by male applicant. Services no longer required. Do not come to Millbrook." "That's not right," Samuel said, his voice growing hard. "A contract is a contract. They can't just change their minds because you're a woman." "Apparently they can." Eleanor's laugh held no joy, just bitter disappointment. "The school board decided they needed a man for the job. Something about discipline and moral authority. As if women can't maintain order in a classroom." Samuel looked around the platform. Most of the other passengers had already left, collected by family or friends or making their own way into town. The train crew was busy unloading freight from the cargo cars, and the locomotive sat cooling with little pings and ticks as the metal contracted. "Where will you go now?" he asked. Eleanor stared at the train as if it might give her answers. "Back to Chicago, I suppose, if I can afford the fare. I spent most of my savings getting here, and I was counting on the teaching salary too." She stopped talking and pressed her lips together. "The next eastbound train doesn't come through until tomorrow morning," Samuel said. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead." Eleanor looked around the small town with its dusty main street and scattered buildings. "Is there a hotel?" "Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house. Clean rooms, good food, reasonable prices. She's a decent woman who won't ask too many questions." Samuel surprised himself by adding, "I could show you the way, if you'd like." Eleanor studied his face carefully, probably wondering if she could trust a stranger. But something in his expression must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Garrett. But I should warn you, I don't have much money left." "We'll figure something out," Samuel said, though he wasn't sure what he meant by that. He picked up her bag, noting how light it was. "Did you bring much with you?" "Just what you see. I sold most of my belongings to pay for the journey. I thought I was starting a new life." Eleanor's voice cracked on the last word. They walked across the platform toward the main street. Samuel matched his longer stride to her shorter one, something he hadn't done since Catherine died. The afternoon sun slanted through the buildings, creating patterns of light and shadow on the dusty ground. "What made you want to come west?" Samuel asked as they walked. "I thought I could make a difference," Eleanor said. "In Chicago, I taught at a school for wealthy children who didn't want to learn. Their parents paid for grades, not education. I wanted to find children who were hungry for knowledge, who would appreciate what I had to offer." Samuel nodded. "There are plenty of kids around here who could use a good teacher. Most of the homesteading families try to teach their children themselves, but they don't have much education to pass on." "It doesn't matter now," Eleanor said sadly. "The school board has made their decision." They reached the main street, which was really just a wide dirt road with buildings on both sides. The general store, the bank, a saloon, and a few other businesses lined the dusty thoroughfare. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat at the end of the street, a white two-story building with a picket fence and a small garden. "There it is," Samuel said, pointing to the house. "Mrs. Henderson lost her husband in the war, and she's been taking in boarders ever since. She's good people." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him. "Mr. Garrett, why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me." Samuel looked at her tear-stained face and saw something he recognized, the particular kind of pain that comes from having your dreams crushed. Because someone should, he said simply. Because it's the right thing to do. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the fading afternoon light. Samuel felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. It scared him more than anything had in years. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Samuel cleared his throat and started walking again. "Come on, let's get you settled before it gets dark." But as they approached the boarding house, neither of them noticed the thin man in black watching them from the shadows of the church across the street, his eyes narrow with disapproval. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Henderson said as she wiped flour from her hands on her apron, studying Eleanor with sharp but kind eyes. The boarding house kitchen smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon, making Eleanor's empty stomach growl loudly enough for everyone to hear. Samuel stood awkwardly by the door, hat in his hands, while Eleanor tried to explain her situation without crying again. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully, nodding at all the right places and making little clucking sounds of sympathy when Eleanor described the cruel telegram. "Those fools on the school board wouldn't know good sense if it bit them on the behind," Mrs. Henderson declared, causing Samuel to cough and look at his boots. "A woman teacher is exactly what this town needs. Heaven knows the children around here could use some proper education instead of whatever nonsense Reverend Blackwood fills their heads with on Sundays." Eleanor felt a spark of hope. "Then you think there might be other opportunities? Perhaps private tutoring?" "Could be," Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully. "Let me show you to your room first, and then we'll talk about possibilities over supper. Mr. Garrett, you're staying too, I hope? I've got a pot roast that's too big for just the three of us." Samuel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I should probably head back to my place. Got chores to do before dark." "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Those chores will wait. Besides, Miss Brennan here could probably use some friendly company after the day she's had." Eleanor looked at Samuel hopefully. "Please stay, Mr. Garrett. I'd like to thank you properly for your kindness, and I find myself not quite ready to be alone with my thoughts." Samuel's resolve crumbled under the weight of two determined women. "Well, I suppose the chores can wait a bit longer." Mrs. Henderson's room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the main street. A patchwork quilt covered the narrow bed, and a washstand with a cracked mirror stood in the corner. Eleanor set her bag on the wooden chair and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time since leaving Chicago. "It's perfect," she told Mrs. Henderson. "How much for the room and meals?" "We'll work something out," Mrs. Henderson said with a wave of her hand. "Right now, you need to wash up and come down for supper. You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in days." When Eleanor came downstairs 20 minutes later, she found Samuel sitting at the kitchen table, turning a coffee cup in his hands and staring out the window. He'd combed his hair and straightened his shirt, and Eleanor noticed for the first time how handsome he was, despite the sadness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "Feel better?" he asked as she took the seat across from him. "Much thank you." Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Henderson and wrapped her hands around it gratefully. "Mr. Garrett, may I ask what you do for a living?" "I farm wheat mostly. Some corn. Got a homestead about 5 miles east of town." Samuel's voice carried a note of pride when he talked about his land. "Been there 7 years now. Built the house myself, cleared the fields, fought off the grasshoppers and the drought and everything else this country could throw at me." "That sounds like hard work," Eleanor said. "It is, but it's good work, honest work. There's something satisfying about planting seeds in the spring and watching them grow into something that can feed people." Samuel paused, then added quietly, "My wife Catherine used to say I talked to the wheat like it was people." Mrs. Henderson set plates of pot roast, potatoes, and carrots in front of them. Catherine was a lovely woman, taken too soon, like so many good folks. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Eleanor could see the pain in Samuel's eyes whenever his wife's name came up, and she wondered what it would be like to be loved that deeply by someone. "Tell me about the families around here," Eleanor said, changing the subject. "Do they have children who might benefit from tutoring?" Samuel's face brightened. "The Andersons have 3 little ones. Tom and his wife Mary are good people, but neither of them had much schooling." Their youngest daughter is sharp as a tack but struggles with her letters. And there's the Kowalski family, Mrs. Henderson added. Polish immigrants with twin boys about 10 years old. Smart as whips, but they speak mostly Polish at home. Could use help with their English. Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest. How many families are we talking about? Maybe 8 or 10 within riding distance, Samuel said. Most of them would jump at the chance to have their children tutored by someone with proper training. But how would I reach them? Eleanor asked. I don't have a horse, and I'm not familiar with the territory. Samuel and Mrs. Henderson exchanged glances. Well, Samuel said slowly, I suppose I could introduce you around. Most folks know me, and they'd trust my recommendation. You would do that? Eleanor's voice was full of surprise and gratitude. Don't see why not, Samuel said, though his cheeks turned slightly red. Could make the rounds tomorrow if you're interested. Give you a chance to meet the families and see if there's enough work to make it worthwhile. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly as she refilled their coffee cups. Sounds like a fine plan to me. Outside, the sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eleanor looked out the window and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Maybe coming to Millbrook hadn't been a mistake after all. But across the street, hidden in the shadows of the church, Reverend Blackwood continued to watch the boarding house with growing disapproval. He'd already heard rumors about the woman teacher and the lonely widower, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Something would have to be done about this situation before it got out of hand. The wagon wheels creaked and bounced over the rutted dirt road as Samuel guided the horses through the morning mist. Eleanor sat beside him on the wooden seat, clutching her small bag of teaching materials and trying not to show how nervous she felt about meeting her first potential students. The Anderson place is just over that rise, Samuel said, pointing ahead with his whip. Fair warning, their dog likes to bark at strangers, but he's all noise and no bite. Sure enough, as they crested the small hill, a large brown dog came racing toward them from the farmhouse below, barking loud enough to wake the dead. Eleanor instinctively moved closer to Samuel on the wagon seat, her heart pounding. Easy there, Bruno, Samuel called out as he pulled the horses to a stop. It's just me and a friend. The dog's tail started wagging as soon as he recognized Samuel's voice, and his fierce barking turned into excited whining. A tall man in overalls emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. Samuel Garrett, the man called out with a big grin. What brings you out this way so early in the morning? Morning, Tom, Samuel replied, jumping down from the wagon and helping Eleanor down beside him. I'd like you to meet Miss Eleanor Brennan. She's a teacher from Chicago, and she's looking to tutor children in the area. Tom Anderson's weathered face lit up with interest. A real teacher? Well, I'll be. Mary's going to be excited to hear this. He turned toward the house and hollered, Mary, come out here, we got company. A woman in a faded blue dress appeared on the porch, drying her hands on her apron. 3 children peeked out from behind her skirts. 2 boys who looked to be about 8 and 6, and a little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 5. This is Miss Brennan, Tom explained as his wife approached. She's a teacher looking to help local children with their learning. Mary Anderson's eyes grew wide. A real teacher? Oh my, we've been praying for something like this. Our little Sarah here is bright as a button, but she's having such trouble with her reading. The little girl with pigtails stepped forward shyly. I can write my name, she announced proudly, then added in a whisper, but the letters all look backward to me. Eleanor knelt down to Sarah's level, her nervousness melting away as she looked into the child's eager eyes. That's perfectly normal, Sarah. Lots of smart children have trouble with letters at first. Would you like me to show you some tricks that might help? Sarah nodded enthusiastically, and Eleanor pulled a small slate and piece of chalk from her bag. Let's try writing your name together, but this time we'll say each letter out loud as we write it. For the next hour, Eleanor worked with all 3 Anderson children while the adults watched in amazement. She showed the older boys how to do long division using small stones as counters, and she helped Sarah practice writing letters by tracing them in the dirt with a stick. She's got a real gift, Mary whispered to Samuel as they watched Eleanor explain fractions using pieces of an apple. The children are learning more in 1 hour than they usually do in a week. Samuel found himself unable to look away from Eleanor's face as she worked with the children. Her whole expression had changed. The sadness was gone, replaced by joy and purpose. She belonged here, he realized. This was what she was meant to do. "What would you charge for regular lessons?" Tom asked, when Eleanor finally looked up from her impromptu classroom. Eleanor hesitated. "I don't want to ask for more than families can afford. Perhaps we could work out some kind of arrangement. Lessons in exchange for goods or services? We could provide eggs and milk," Mary offered quickly, "and Tom grows the best vegetables in the county." "That would be wonderful," Eleanor said with a smile. "Shall we say twice a week to start? I could come on Tuesdays and Fridays if that works for your schedule." As they prepared to leave for the next homestead, little Sarah tugged on Eleanor's skirt. "Miss Brennan, will you really come back? Promise?" Eleanor knelt down and took the child's hands in hers. "I promise, Sarah. And next time, I'll bring some books with pictures that might help you remember which way the letters face." The ride to the Kowalski farm was longer, taking them through a valley dotted with wildflowers and across a small creek that sparkled in the morning sun. Eleanor found herself relaxing for the first time in days, enjoying the rhythm of the wagon and the easy conversation with Samuel. "You were right about the children being hungry for learning," she said as they bumped along the trail. "Did you see how quickly they picked up those concepts?" Samuel nodded. Most of these families came west, looking for a better life for their children. Education is part of that dream, but it's hard to provide when you're struggling just to survive. The Kowalski farm appeared in the distance, marked by neat rows of vegetables and a red barn that looked freshly painted. Two boys were working in the garden, their dark hair gleaming in the sunlight as they bent over the potato plants. "Jan! Pavel!" Samuel called out as they approached. "Come meet your new teacher." The boys looked up with curious expressions, chattering to each other in Polish before approaching the wagon cautiously. Their parents emerged from the house, a sturdy man with kind eyes and a woman wearing a colorful headscarf. "Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski," Samuel said, jumping down from the wagon. "This is Miss Eleanor Brennan, the teacher I told you about." The woman spoke rapidly in Polish to her husband, who nodded and stepped forward with a shy smile. "Welcome," he said in heavily accented English. "We are, how you say, very happy to meet Teacher Lady." For the next hour, Eleanor worked with Jan and Pavel, quickly discovering that while their English was limited, their mathematical abilities were extraordinary. They could solve complex problems in their heads that would challenge children twice their age. "These boys are incredibly gifted," she told their parents through a combination of English, gestures, and simple drawings. "With proper instruction, they could go far in life." Mrs. Kowalski wiped tears from her eyes and spoke rapidly to her husband in Polish. He nodded and turned to Eleanor with deep gratitude in his voice. She says, you are answer to prayers. We come to America so boys have chance for education. You make this possible, yes?" "Yes," Eleanor said firmly, "we'll make this possible." As they drove back toward town in the late afternoon, Eleanor felt more hopeful than she had in months. The work would be challenging, and the pay would be modest, but she would be making a real difference in these children's lives. "Thank you," she said to Samuel, as the town came into view. "I couldn't have done this without your help." Samuel glanced at her sideways, noting how the afternoon light brought out the red highlights in her hair. "Seems to me you did all the hard work. I just provided the transportation." But neither of them noticed the black buggy that had followed them at a distance all day, or the man in dark clothing who had been watching their every move with growing disapproval. Thunder crashed overhead like God himself was angry, and Eleanor pressed her face against the window of the line shack, watching lightning split the dark sky in jagged white lines. The October storm had come out of nowhere, turning their routine trip back from the Peterson farm into a fight for survival against nature's fury. "Wind's getting worse," Samuel said from where he knelt by the small wood stove, feeding pieces of dried timber into the hungry flames. Ice pellets hammered against the roof like bullets, and the whole cabin shook with each gust of wind that roared across the prairie. Eleanor pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved away from the frost-covered window. The one-room shelter felt smaller by the minute, with its 2 narrow beds, rough wooden table, and walls that seemed to groan under the storm's assault. Samuel had found this place just in time. Another 10 minutes in the open wagon, and they might have frozen to death. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Samuel poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. "Could be hours. Could be all night. No way to tell with weather like this." He glanced at her concerned face and added, "Don't worry. We've got enough wood to keep warm, and there's some canned food in that cupboard over there." The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour, and Eleanor could see her breath when she moved away from the stove's warmth. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, and snow was beginning to pile up against the door. "I should check on the horses," Samuel said, reaching for his heavy coat. "Don't you dare go out there," Eleanor said quickly. "Those animals are tougher than we are. They'll find shelter in that little lean-to behind the cabin." Samuel paused with his hand on the door latch. "You sure?" "I'm sure. I'd rather worry about cold horses than a frozen man." Eleanor surprised herself with how firmly she spoke. Back in Chicago, she'd always been the timid one, letting others make decisions for her. But something about this wild country was bringing out a strength she didn't know she possessed. As the hours passed, they shared the meager supplies they found in the cabin, some hardtack, beans, and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting there since the war. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the reality of spending the night in close quarters began to sink in for both of them. "You take that bed," Samuel said, pointing to the one farthest from the door. "I'll make do with blankets on the floor." "Absolutely not," Eleanor replied. "You're twice my size, and that floor looks hard as a rock. We're both adults here. We can share the space without any impropriety." Samuel's face turned red in the firelight. "Miss Brennan, I don't think that would be. I mean, people might." "People aren't here," Eleanor pointed out practically. "And frankly, I'm more concerned about surviving the night than what the town gossips might say tomorrow." They arranged themselves as properly as possible, Eleanor on one bed fully clothed, Samuel on the other with his back turned. But as the fire died down and the cold crept in through every crack in the walls, practical concerns overcame social conventions. "I can't feel my fingers," Eleanor whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. Without a word, Samuel got up and added more wood to the stove. The flames leaped higher, but the heat seemed to disappear into the frigid air before it could warm the room properly. "Come here," Samuel said quietly. "Bring your blanket. We need to share body heat or we're both going to freeze." Eleanor didn't argue. She wrapped her blanket around herself and sat beside Samuel on his narrow bed, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. They sat there in awkward silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. "Tell me about Catherine," Eleanor said suddenly. Samuel tensed beside her. "Why?" "Because I can feel how much you loved her, and because I think talking about her might help both of us get through this night." Eleanor pulled her blanket tighter. "What was she like?" Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She was light. Does that make sense? Catherine could walk into a room and make everything brighter just by being there. She had this laugh that sounded like music, and she could find something good in the worst situations." His voice grew softer. "She wanted children so badly. We tried for 5 years, but it just never happened." "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered. "When the fever took her, I thought it was my fault somehow, like I hadn't protected her enough or loved her enough or—" Samuel's voice broke. "I swore on her grave that I'd never let myself care about anyone that way again. Couldn't bear to lose someone else." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks. "And now?" Samuel turned to look at her in the flickering firelight. "Now I'm sitting in a freezing cabin with a woman who makes me forget how to breathe, and I'm scared out of my mind." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor reached out slowly and took Samuel's hand in both of hers. His skin was rough and calloused from years of hard work, but warm and strong. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "But maybe being scared together is better than being brave alone." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the little cabin, but inside, Something had shifted between them. They talked through the night, about dreams and disappointments, about the past and the uncertain future, about the way life could break your heart and then surprise you when you least expected it. When dawn finally broke over the snow-covered prairie, Eleanor woke to find herself curled against Samuel's side, his arm around her shoulders and his coat spread over both of them like a shared blanket. For a moment, she didn't move, savoring the feeling of being protected and cared for. Samuel stirred and immediately started to pull away. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Eleanor said softly. "We kept each other warm. We survived. That's what matters." The general store buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped dead the moment Eleanor walked through the door, her boots still damp from melted snow and her cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. Every eye in the place turned to stare at her, and she felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. "Morning, Miss Brennan," old Pete called out from behind the counter, his voice carefully neutral. "Heard you and Samuel got caught in that storm yesterday." Eleanor lifted her chin and walked to the counter with as much dignity as she could manage. "Yes, we were fortunate to find shelter at the line shack. It was quite a fierce storm." The three women clustered near the fabric display exchanged meaningful glances. Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear, we're all just so concerned about you," she said in a voice dripping with false sweetness. "A young, unmarried woman spending the night alone with a man. Well, people are bound to talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor replied evenly, though her heart was pounding. "Mr. Garrett behaved like a perfect gentleman, and we both would have frozen to death if not for that shelter." "Oh, I'm sure he did," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "But you must understand how it looks. Perhaps it would be better if you limited your tutoring activities to families closer to town. For your own reputation, you understand." Eleanor felt her temper rising. "My reputation is based on my character and my work, Mrs. Hartwell, not on the gossip of people who have nothing better to do than create scandals where none exist." The women gasped at Eleanor's boldness. In their world, ladies were supposed to accept criticism meekly and apologize for any perceived impropriety, even when they'd done nothing wrong. Old Pete cleared his throat loudly. "Miss Brennan, I believe you wanted to pick up those books you ordered?" "Yes, thank you," Eleanor said gratefully, recognizing his attempt to change the subject. She'd used her last bit of savings to order primers and slate boards for her students, and she was eager to see if they'd arrived on yesterday's train. While Pete went to fetch her package, the store's door opened with a sharp bang that made everyone jump. Reverend Blackwood strode in wearing his black coat and an expression of righteous anger that made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread. "Miss Brennan," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the store, "I've been looking for you." "Reverend Blackwood," Eleanor replied, forcing herself to remain calm. "How can I help you?" "You can help by explaining why you were seen emerging from a line shack this morning in the company of Samuel Garrett, both of you looking like you'd spent the night in intimate circumstances." The accusation hit Eleanor like a slap. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. "We were caught in a blizzard, Reverend. We took shelter to avoid freezing to death. Nothing improper occurred." "So you say," Blackwood replied coldly. "But appearances matter, Miss Brennan. A woman of loose morals has no business teaching innocent children." "Loose morals?" Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to stay composed. "How dare you suggest such a thing? I have done nothing but work to educate the children of this community. You have been gallivanting across the countryside with a man who is not your husband?" Blackwood continued relentlessly. "Spending days alone in his company, and now nights as well. Such behavior is scandalous and will not be tolerated in a Christian community." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. Every person in the store was watching, waiting to see how she would respond to this public attack on her character. She thought of little Sarah Anderson struggling with her letters, of the Kowalski boys eager to learn English, of all the children who were finally getting the education they deserved. "Reverend Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "I came here to teach children. That is exactly what I have been doing, with great success and complete propriety. If you choose to see sin where none exists, that says more about your mind than mine." Gasps echoed through the store. No one had ever spoken to Reverend Blackwood with such directness, especially not a woman. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "You will cease this tutoring immediately, Miss Brennan. You will leave Millbrook on the next train, or I will make sure that every decent family in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you are." Eleanor felt something inside her snap. All the years of being told what she could and couldn't do, all the time she'd been dismissed simply for being female, all the dreams that had been crushed by small-minded men who confused power with righteousness, it all came pouring out. "No," she said firmly, "I will not be driven away by threats and lies. I will continue teaching because those children need me, and because I have every right to make an honest living in whatever way I choose." The store fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Everyone stared at Eleanor as if she'd just announced she was planning to sprout wings and fly. Blackwood leaned forward menacingly. "You have until Sunday to leave town, Miss Brennan. After that, I cannot be responsible for what happens to your reputation." He turned on his heel and stalked out of the store, leaving Eleanor standing in the middle of the shocked crowd. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she turned to Pete. "Are my books ready?" she asked. Pete nodded wordlessly and handed her the package. Eleanor paid for her purchases and walked toward the door with her head held high, though she felt like her knees might give out at any moment. As she reached for the door handle, Mrs. Anderson appeared beside her. Tom's wife had been shopping quietly in the corner during the entire confrontation, and now she stepped forward with determination in her eyes. "Miss Brennan," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Sarah has been practicing her letters every day since your last visit. She's reading whole words now. We'll see you on Tuesday as planned." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. Yes, I'll be there on Tuesday." As she walked back to the boarding house, Eleanor realized that Reverend Blackwood had just made a terrible mistake. He'd forced her to choose between running away and standing her ground, and Eleanor Brennan was done running from bullies. The battle lines had been drawn, and she intended to win. Samuel's fist connected with the barn wall so hard that splinters flew, and his knuckles split open, blood dripping onto the hay-covered floor below. The pain felt good, clean, and simple compared to the mess of emotions churning in his chest after hearing about Eleanor's confrontation with Reverend Blackwood. "Damn fool preacher," Samuel muttered, shaking his injured hand and immediately feeling guilty for cursing. Catherine had always scolded him for using rough language, even when he was angry enough to spit nails. His horse, Thunder, snorted and stamped in the nearby stall, sensing his master's agitation. Samuel had ridden hard from town after Pete quietly told him what had happened at the general store, and the animal was still breathing heavily from the urgent journey home. Samuel paced the length of the barn, his boots echoing off the wooden walls. 3 years he'd kept to himself, minded his own business, avoided getting tangled up in other people's problems. Now Eleanor had walked into his life and turned everything upside down, and he didn't know whether to thank her or run as far as his legs could carry him. The barn door creaked open, and Samuel spun around expecting to see Eleanor. Instead, Tom Anderson stepped inside, his weathered face grim with purpose. "Heard there was trouble in town," Tom said without preamble. "Thought you might want to know that some of us are meeting tonight at my place, about Miss Brennan's situation." Samuel's jaw tightened. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where decent folks decide they've had enough of Cyrus Blackwood telling them how to live their lives." Tom's voice carried an edge Samuel had never heard before. "That man's been poisoning this community for years with his talk of sin and judgment. Time someone stood up to him." "Could be dangerous," Samuel warned. "Blackwood's got influence with the territorial government. He could make things hard for anyone who crosses him." Tom's eyes flashed. "He's already making things hard. My Mary came home from the store in tears because Mrs. Hartwell told her we shouldn't associate with women of questionable virtue. Sarah's been asking why people are saying mean things about her teacher." Samuel felt his anger surge again. The idea of anyone hurting that sweet little girl with their ugly gossip made him want to break something else. preferably Blackwood's sanctimonious face. "What time?" he asked. "After supper. Bring whoever you think might listen to reason." Tom paused at the barn door. "Samuel, that woman's worth fighting for. Don't let fear make you lose something precious twice." After Tom left, Samuel stood alone in the gathering dusk, wrestling with memories and possibilities. He walked to the small wooden box where he kept Catherine's letters and pulled out the one she'd written during her final illness, when she'd known she was dying but tried to hide it from him. "My dearest Samuel," he read aloud in the empty barn, "if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead to wait for you on the other side. Please don't spend your life mourning what we lost. Instead, celebrate what we had, and if love finds you again, don't push it away out of guilt or fear. I want you to be happy, my darling. That's all I ever wanted." Samuel folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. Catherine had been gone 3 years, but her words still had the power to guide him when he lost his way. She'd loved him enough to set him free, and now Eleanor needed someone to fight for her the way he'd been too broken to fight for anything since Catherine's death. He saddled Thunder again and rode toward the Anderson farm as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The November air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys and the promise of winter's approach. The Anderson farmhouse glowed with warm yellow light, and Samuel could see figures moving inside. He tied Thunder to the hitching post and knocked on the door, his heart beating faster than it had in years. "Samuel!" Mary Anderson opened the door with a smile. "Come in. Come in. The others are already here." Samuel stepped into the warm kitchen and was surprised to see how many people had come. Jan Kowalski sat at the table with his wife, their faces determined despite their limited English. Old Pete from the general store was there, along with Doc Harrison and even quiet Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. "Glad you could make it," Tom said, standing up from his chair by the fireplace. "We were just discussing how to handle this situation with Miss Brennan and the Reverend." "What's there to discuss?" Pete spoke up in his gravelly voice. "That woman's done more good for our children in 3 weeks than Blackwood's done for this whole community in 3 years. We need to stand by her." "But how?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Blackwood's got the school board in his pocket, and half the town's afraid to cross him." "Then we make our own rules," Doc Harrison said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the usually mild-mannered physician. "We don't need his permission to hire a private tutor for our children. We don't need his approval to associate with decent people." Jan Kowalski cleared his throat and spoke carefully in his accented English. "In old country, we know men like this preacher. They use fear to control people. But when good people stand together," he shrugged expressively. Samuel found himself speaking before he'd planned what to say. "Miss Brennan's not just a good teacher, she's a good person who's being attacked for things she didn't do. If we let Blackwood run her out of town with lies and threats, what does that say about us as a community?" "Exactly," Mary Anderson said firmly. "Sarah's reading better than ever, and she lights up every time Miss Brennan comes to visit. I won't let some bitter old man destroy that child's chance at a real education." They talked for another hour, planning and strategizing. By the time the meeting broke up, they'd formed what Tom jokingly called the Millbrook Education Committee, a group of families committed to supporting Eleanor's tutoring work regardless of what Reverend Blackwood might say or do. As Samuel rode home under the star-filled sky, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered. Eleanor had awakened more than just his heart. She'd reminded him what it meant to stand up for what was right. Tomorrow, he would tell her about the meeting and about the people who believed in her. But tonight, he would sit by his fireplace and write a letter of his own, one that Catherine would have been proud of him to send. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the letter that had been slipped under her boarding house door sometime during the night, its message written in block letters designed to hide the sender's identity. "Leave town or face the consequences." Mrs. Henderson found her sitting on the porch steps at dawn, still in her nightgown and robe, staring at the threatening words with a mixture of fear and fury burning in her green eyes. "Child, what's wrong?" Mrs. Henderson asked, settling her considerable bulk on the step beside Eleanor despite the morning chill. Eleanor handed over the letter without speaking. Mrs. Henderson read it quickly, her face growing darker with each word. "Cowardly snake," she muttered, "writing anonymous threats like some common criminal. I've got half a mind to march over to that church and give Cyrus Blackwood a piece of my mind." "You think it was him?" Eleanor asked, though she'd already reached the same conclusion. "Who else would it be? That man's been stirring up trouble ever since you arrived in town." Mrs. Henderson's voice softened. "But don't you worry, dear. You've got more friends than you know." As if summoned by her words, the sound of wagon wheels echoed from the street. Eleanor looked up to see Samuel approaching with thunder, pulling his loaded supply wagon. But something was different about his posture. Straighter, more determined than she'd seen him before. "Morning, ladies," Samuel called out as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Eleanor, I've got something important to tell you." He climbed down from the wagon and walked to the porch steps, his eyes serious but kind. "Last night, Tom Anderson called a meeting. Turns out you've got more support in this town than Reverend Blackwood wants you to believe." Eleanor felt a spark of hope. What kind of support? "The kind that matters. The families whose children you're teaching, the people who've seen the good work you're doing." Samuel pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "We've formed what we're calling the Millbrook Education Committee. Officially, we're hiring you as a private tutor for our children, completely independent of the school board or anyone else's approval." Eleanor unfolded the paper and gasped. It was a contract, signed by 8 different families, guaranteeing her work and payment for the rest of the school year. At the bottom, in Samuel's careful handwriting, was a note: "For services as tutor and friend to the children and families of Millbrook Territory. Payment in goods, services, and the respect of grateful parents." "I don't know what to say," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Say you'll stay," Samuel replied simply. "Say you'll keep teaching our children and ignore whatever threats that bitter old man might make." Mrs. Henderson stood up and brushed dust from her skirts. "I'll go start breakfast. You two have planning to do." She paused at the door and added with a wink, "And Samuel? Next time you want to have a serious conversation with a lady, you might wait until she's properly dressed." Eleanor looked down at her nightgown and robe, suddenly aware of how improper the situation must appear. But instead of embarrassment, she felt something else, a growing sense that the old rules about propriety mattered less than the connections being built between honest people. "There's something else," Samuel said once Mrs. Henderson had gone inside. "I want you to know that I've decided to court you properly, if you'll have me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Samuel, I know it's complicated. I know people will talk. But I also know that Catherine would want me to be happy, and you make me happier than I've been in 3 years." Samuel's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking if you'll give us a chance to see where this might lead." Eleanor stood up slowly, the threatening letter forgotten on the porch step. "Are you sure? Because if we do this, there's no going back to the way things were. Reverend Blackwood will use it against both of us." "Let him try," Samuel said firmly. "I've spent 3 years hiding from life because I was afraid of losing someone again. But I've learned that the fear of loss isn't worth the certainty of loneliness." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the silver threads in Samuel's dark hair and the determination in his brown eyes. "Then yes, Samuel Garrett, I'll give us a chance." They stood there on the porch for a long moment, not touching but connected by something stronger than physical contact, a mutual decision to face whatever came next together rather than apart. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Reverend Blackwood rode up on his black horse, his face twisted with anger as he took in the scene before him. "Miss Brennan," he called out in a voice that carried across the street, "I see you've chosen to ignore my warning about leaving town." Eleanor lifted her chin and stepped forward. "I've chosen to ignore your threats, Reverend. There's a difference." "And you, Samuel Garrett," Blackwood continued, "I'm surprised at you. Carrying on with a woman of questionable reputation so soon after your wife's death, Catherine must be turning in her grave." Samuel's face went white with rage, but Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm before he could respond. "Reverend Blackwood," she said in a voice that could have cut glass, "you don't know the first thing about Catherine Garrett or what she would have wanted for her husband. But I do know that she would never have approved of a man who uses a woman's memory as a weapon against the living. Blackwood's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. "This community will not tolerate your immoral behavior much longer, Miss Brennan. I suggest you reconsider your position before it's too late." "The only thing this community won't tolerate much longer," Eleanor replied calmly, "is a preacher who confuses judgment with righteousness and fear with faith." With that, she turned her back on him and walked into the boarding house, leaving Samuel and Blackwood facing each other in the morning sunshine. The battle for Eleanor's place in Millbrook had begun in earnest, and both sides knew there could be only one winner. The church bell tolled 11 times, echoing across Millbrook's empty streets as Eleanor crept through the shadows behind the buildings, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. She clutched a bundle of books and papers to her chest, moving as quietly as possible toward the abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of town. 3 days had passed since Reverend Blackwood's ultimatum, and the pressure was building like steam in a kettle. 2 families had already backed out of their tutoring contracts after visits from the Reverend, and Eleanor could feel the noose of public opinion tightening around her neck. But she refused to give up, not when children like Sarah Anderson were finally learning to read. The schoolhouse door creaked as Eleanor pushed it open, wincing at the sound that seemed loud as thunder in the midnight quiet. Moonlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating rows of empty desks and a blackboard covered with arithmetic problems from months ago. This was where she was supposed to have taught, before small minds and smaller hearts decided a woman wasn't fit for the job. Eleanor lit a kerosene lamp and set it on the teacher's desk, then began arranging her materials. If the community wouldn't let her teach openly, she'd do it in secret. The children deserved better than ignorance, even if their parents were too frightened to stand up for what was right. Footsteps on the wooden porch made her freeze. Had someone seen her sneak into the building? Was Reverend Blackwood coming to catch her in the act of trespassing? Eleanor blew out the lamp and crouched behind the desk, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door opened slowly, and a small voice whispered, "Miss Eleanor, are you in here?" Eleanor's heart leaped with relief. "Sarah, what are you doing here, child?" Little Sarah Anderson stepped into the moonlight, followed by her 2 older brothers and, to Eleanor's amazement, the Kowalski twins. All 5 children carried slates and pieces of chalk, their faces determined despite their obvious fear. "Mama said we couldn't have lessons anymore," Sarah explained in a whisper. "But Pavel heard his parents talking about how you might leave town, and we decided we couldn't let that happen. We need to learn, Miss Eleanor. We need you to teach us." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. These brave children had risked their parents' anger and possible punishment to continue their education. How could she do any less? "All right," she said, relighting the lamp but keeping it low. "But we have to be very quiet, and if anyone comes, you must all hide under the desks. Can you promise me that?" 5 small heads nodded solemnly, and Eleanor began the most important lesson of her life. She worked with each child individually, helping Sarah sound out words in a primer, showing the boys advanced arithmetic, and teaching the twins new English vocabulary. The children absorbed everything like dry earth soaking up rain, their hunger for knowledge evident in every question they asked. An hour into the secret lesson, Sarah suddenly grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. Eleanor heard it too, the sound of multiple horses approaching the schoolhouse. She quickly blew out the lamp and motioned for the children to hide under the desks, her mind racing. If they were caught, the children would be in serious trouble, and her own situation would become impossible. The footsteps on the porch were heavy and deliberate. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she recognized Reverend Blackwood's voice outside the door. "I tell you, I saw a light in here. Someone's using this building without permission." The door handle rattled. Probably that Brennan woman, trying to corrupt more innocent children. Eleanor held her breath, praying that the children would stay hidden and quiet. The door opened, and she could see the silhouette of 3 men against the star-filled sky. Blackwood entered first, holding a lantern high, followed by 2 other figures Eleanor didn't recognize. "Search every corner," Blackwood commanded. "If she's here, We'll catch her in the act of trespassing and put an end to this nonsense once and for all." Eleanor pressed herself against the floor behind the teacher's desk, her heart beating so loudly she was sure the men could hear it. One of them walked right past her hiding spot, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. She could smell tobacco and unwashed clothes as he moved through the classroom. "Nothing here, Reverend," one of the men called out. "Just dust and old lessons." "Check the back room," Blackwood ordered, his voice tight with frustration. While the men searched the storage area, Eleanor caught a glimpse of movement under one of the desks. Sarah was trying to adjust her position, and Eleanor feared the little girl might accidentally make a noise that would give them all away. "Wait," Blackwood said suddenly. "What's this?" Eleanor's heart stopped as she saw him pick up a piece of chalk that one of the children must have dropped. The Reverend examined it closely, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This chalk is fresh," he announced. "Someone has been using this building recently. Very recently." The other men gathered around him, and Eleanor could see their faces in the lantern light, rough-looking characters who seemed more like hired muscle than concerned citizens. She realized with growing alarm that Blackwood was escalating beyond mere threats. "Fan out and search the area," Blackwood commanded. "Check the church, the boarding house, everywhere. Someone's been teaching children in secret, and I intend to find out who." As the men left to continue their search, Eleanor waited until their voices faded into the distance before finally allowing herself to breathe again. One by one, the children emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale with fear but their determination unshaken. "Will you keep teaching us?" Sarah whispered. "Even if it's dangerous?" Eleanor looked at the 5 young faces turned toward her with such hope and trust, and she knew there was only one answer she could give. "Yes," she said firmly, "but we'll have to be even more careful from now on." Samuel's axe bit deep into the oak log with a satisfying thunk, splitting it cleanly in two as sweat poured down his face despite the November chill. He'd been chopping wood since dawn, working out his frustration and anger on the innocent timber, while his mind wrestled with the impossible situation Eleanor faced. The sound of approaching horses made him look up from his work. Tom Anderson rode into the yard, leading a second horse, his face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for a social visit. "Samuel," Tom called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk. It's about Miss Brennan." Samuel set down his axe and wiped his hands on his work shirt. What's happened now? Blackwood stepped up his campaign. "He's been visiting families all morning, telling them their children will be refused church services if they continue with the tutoring lessons." Tom's voice carried a mix of anger and fear. "Some folks are starting to crack under the pressure." Samuel felt his jaw clench. "How many have pulled out?" 3 more families since yesterday. The Hendersons, the Millers, and— Tom hesitated. "I hate to say it, but the Kowalskis are wavering. Mrs. Kowalski is terrified that Blackwood will report them to the territorial authorities as troublemakers. You know how nervous immigrants get about drawing attention from the government." Samuel began pacing back and forth in front of his cabin, his boots wearing a path in the dirt. "That snake is using people's fears against them. Fear of being ostracized, fear of losing their standing in the community, fear of being branded as troublemakers. There's more," Tom continued reluctantly. "Blackwood brought in some outside help. 3 men from Omaha who look like they'd break your legs for $1. Word is, they're here to maintain order and make sure undesirable elements leave town peacefully." Samuel stopped pacing and turned to face his friend. "Are you saying he's hired muscle to intimidate Eleanor?" "I'm saying it looks that way. Doc Harrison saw them hanging around the boarding house this morning, and Mrs. Henderson is scared enough that she asked her nephew to come stay for a few days." Tom's weathered face showed his concern. "Samuel, this situation is getting dangerous. Maybe Miss Brennan should consider leaving before someone gets hurt." "No." Samuel's voice was flat and final. "Eleanor came here to teach children, and that's exactly what she's going to do. If Blackwood wants a fight, he'll get one." Tom studied his friend's face and saw something there that reminded him of the old Samuel, the man who'd fought off claim jumpers and survived 3 brutal winters through sheer determination. "What do you have in mind?" Tom asked. Samuel walked to his cabin and emerged a moment later carrying his rifle and a box of ammunition. I'm going to town to have a conversation with these visitors from Omaha, man to man. That's not smart, Samuel. 3 against 1 isn't good odds, especially when they're professionals and you're just a farmer. Then don't let it be 3 against 1. Samuel checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. Spread the word to the other men in the education committee. If they want to help Eleanor, now's the time to prove it. Tom nodded slowly. What about Miss Brennan? Does she know about the hired guns? Not yet. I'll warn her after I deal with Blackwood's friends. Samuel slung the rifle over his shoulder and started toward the barn to saddle Thunder. Tom, there's something else. I found boot prints around my property this morning. Someone's been watching the place. You think they're planning something? I think Blackwood's decided that getting rid of Eleanor isn't enough. He wants to make an example of anyone who supported her. Samuel's voice grew hard. He picked the wrong man to threaten. The ride to town gave Samuel time to think about what he was planning to do. He'd been a peaceful man since Catherine's death, avoiding confrontation and keeping to himself. But Eleanor had awakened something in him that went beyond romantic feelings. She'd reminded him what it meant to fight for what was right. Main Street was unusually quiet when Samuel arrived, with most people staying indoors and avoiding the tension that hung over the town like smoke from a grass fire. Samuel tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the saloon and walked through the bat-wing doors with purpose. The 3 strangers weren't hard to spot. They sat at a corner table, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in a frontier town. Their eyes were cold and calculating, and they watched Samuel with the kind of attention that professional fighters paid to potential threats. Samuel walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey, letting them get a good look at him while he planned his approach. The bartender, a nervous man named Eddie, poured the drink with shaking hands. You the farmer who's been causing trouble for the Reverend? The question came from the largest of the 3 men, a barrel-chested brute with scars on his knuckles and a voice like gravel. Samuel turned slowly, his hand resting casually near his rifle. Depends on what you consider trouble. Teaching children to read and write doesn't seem problematic to me. Smart mouth, another man observed. Reverend said you might be difficult. Samuel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Reverend Blackwood doesn't know the half of it, but maybe you gentlemen would like to find out for yourselves. The tension in the saloon ratcheted up several notches. The few other patrons began edging toward the door, sensing that violence was about to erupt. Samuel set down his whiskey glass and faced the 3 men fully. Here's how this is going to work, he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. You're going to finish your drinks, walk out that door, and catch the next train back to whatever hole you crawled out of. If I see you near Miss Brennan or anyone else in this town again, we're going to have a much less friendly conversation. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Samuel could see them calculating odds and weighing their options. They were professionals, but they were also outnumbered by the local men who were beginning to gather outside the saloon. Tom Anderson appeared in the doorway, followed by Doc Harrison and several other members of the education committee. The largest man stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his coat. Mister, you're making a mistake. No, Samuel replied calmly. The mistake was coming to my town and threatening people I care about. Now you get to decide whether you leave walking or whether we carry you to the train station. Samuel knew the next few seconds would determine not just Eleanor's fate, but the future of their entire community. The church doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the stone walls, making every person in the packed pews jump as if lightning had struck the building. Eleanor stood silhouetted in the doorway, her dark blue dress rippling in the wind, her auburn hair catching the morning light like fire, as she faced down a congregation that had gathered to hear Reverend Blackwood's sermon about moral corruption in our community. Reverend Blackwood, Eleanor called out in a voice that carried to every corner of the sanctuary, I believe you have something that belongs to me. A collective gasp rose from the assembled townspeople. Women clutched their prayer books tighter, men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and children peeked around their parents to get a better look at the woman who dared to interrupt Sunday service. Blackwood stood frozen at his pulpit, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation in the span of a heartbeat. Behind Eleanor, Samuel appeared in the doorway, followed by Tom Anderson, Doc Harrison, and half a dozen other men from the education committee. Their presence sent murmurs rippling through the congregation like stones dropped in still water. "Miss Brennan," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false concern, "surely you can see that this is neither the time nor the place for whatever grievance you imagine you have with me." Eleanor stepped into the church, her boots clicking against the wooden floor as she walked down the center aisle. Every eye followed her movement, and the tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. "On the contrary, Reverend, this is exactly the right time and place." Eleanor stopped halfway to the pulpit and turned to address the congregation directly. "These good people have been listening to your version of recent events. I think they deserve to hear the truth." "The truth?" Blackwood's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The truth is that you're a woman of questionable morals who has been corrupting the children of this community with your inappropriate behavior." Eleanor's green eyes flashed dangerously. "The truth is that you stole books and teaching materials from the schoolhouse last night while I was conducting secret lessons for children whose parents are too frightened of you to let them learn openly." More gasps echoed through the church. Several people turned to stare at Blackwood with new interest, including Mrs. Murphy, whose grandson had been struggling with his letters until Eleanor began tutoring him. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Blackwood replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a torn piece of paper. "Then perhaps you can explain why I found this fragment of a letter in the schoolhouse this morning. A letter bearing your handwriting about removing all evidence of unauthorized teaching activities." The piece of paper might as well have been a lit stick of dynamite for the effect it had on the congregation. People began whispering among themselves, and Eleanor could see doubt creeping into faces that had been set against her just moments before. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "You have no right to make accusations in the house of God. This is sacred ground, not a courtroom." "You're absolutely right," Eleanor agreed. "This is sacred ground. A place where truth should matter more than politics, where protecting children should take priority over protecting egos, where love should triumph over fear." She turned to face the congregation again, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I came to Millbrook to teach your children. I've watched little Sarah Anderson learn to read entire sentences. I've seen the Kowalski boys master English grammar that will help them succeed in this country their parents chose for them. I've witnessed the joy in young faces when they finally understand a mathematical concept that had been confusing them for months." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "And in return, I've been called immoral, threatened with violence, and forced to teach in secret because a man who claims to serve God has decided that education is somehow sinful when it comes from a woman." Old Pete stood up from his pew near the back of the church. "Reverend, I've been listening to your sermons for 3 years, and I can't recall you ever mentioning that teaching children was against God's will." "Sit down, Peter," Blackwood commanded, but his authority was beginning to crack like ice in spring. Instead, Mrs. Anderson rose to her feet. "My daughter can read now because of Miss Brennan. She's happier, more confident, and excited about learning. If that's corruption, then I'll take it over ignorance any day." One by one, other parents began standing up. The Kowalskis, despite their fear of government attention, rose together and spoke in their heavily accented English. "Miss Eleanor, good teacher. She help our boys become Americans." Blackwood watched his congregation turning against him with growing desperation. "You're all being deceived by a woman who spent the night alone with Samuel Garrett in improper circumstances." Samuel stepped forward from the back of the church, his face dark with anger. "Reverend, you've gone too far. Eleanor and I were caught in a blizzard and took shelter to avoid freezing to death. If you see sin in survival, then maybe you need to examine your own heart. Furthermore," Samuel continued, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "I've asked Eleanor to marry me, and she's agreed. So if you have any more concerns about propriety, you can direct them to me as her future husband." The announcement hit the congregation like a thunderbolt. Eleanor spun around to stare at Samuel with wide eyes. They'd talked about courtship, but this was the first mention of an actual proposal. Samuel met her gaze steadily, and she saw in his brown eyes a question and a promise all at once. "Samuel Garrett," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you proposing to me in front of the entire town?" "I'm telling the entire town that I love you," Samuel replied simply, "and that any man who threatens you will have to answer to me." Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is blasphemy. I will not perform a marriage ceremony for two people who've been living in sin." Doc Harrison's voice cut through the Reverend's protests with surgical precision. "Then it's a good thing the territorial law allows any ordained minister to perform marriages, isn't it? And I happen to know that Pastor Williams from the next county would be happy to officiate." The church erupted in conversation as people turned to their neighbors, discussing this unexpected turn of events. Eleanor walked slowly towards Samuel, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy, fear, and overwhelming love. "Is this really how you wanted to propose?" she asked when she reached him. Samuel took her hands in his, oblivious to the crowd around them. "I wanted to propose in a way that would leave no doubt about my intentions, in a way that would protect you from any more of his lies." Eleanor looked into Samuel's eyes and saw her future reflected there, not just as his wife, but as a partner in building something good and lasting in this wild country. "Then yes, Samuel Garrett, I'll marry you." As they embraced in front of the entire congregation, Blackwood realized that his power over the community had just crumbled like a house built on sand. 6 months later, the new schoolhouse rose from the prairie like a promise made real, its fresh timber gleaming golden in the June sunshine, while Eleanor stood in the doorway wearing her simple white wedding dress, watching children and adults alike gather for the celebration that would mark both her marriage to Samuel and the opening of Millbrook's first official school. "Are you ready, Mrs. Garrett?" Samuel asked, appearing at her elbow in his best suit, a wildflower boutonniere pinned to his lapel and love shining in his brown eyes. Eleanor smiled at the sound of her new name. They'd been married 3 weeks ago, in a ceremony performed by Pastor Williams under the cottonwood tree where Catherine was buried, a choice that had surprised everyone except Samuel, who said Catherine would have wanted to be part of their new beginning. "I'm ready," Eleanor replied, smoothing her skirts and checking that the ribbon in her hair was straight. "Are you sure about this? Once I ring that school bell, there's no going back. You'll be married to the most notorious schoolmarm in the Nebraska Territory." Samuel laughed, the sound rich and free. "I wouldn't have it any other way. Besides, after everything we've been through, I think we can handle whatever comes next." The crowd outside was larger than either of them had expected. Not just the families from their original education committee, but people from neighboring counties who had heard about the community that had stood up to fear and chosen knowledge instead. Children ran between the adults, their faces bright with excitement about the real school with real desks and a real teacher. Eleanor spotted Sarah Anderson near the front of the crowd, now reading at a level far beyond her age and helping her younger classmates with their letters. The Kowalski twins stood with their parents, chattering in rapid English about the mathematics problems they hoped to tackle in the new term. Even shy little Mary Peterson was there, the girl whose parents had almost withdrawn her from lessons until they saw how much her confidence had grown under Eleanor's guidance. "Where's the Reverend?" Samuel asked, scanning the crowd. "Gone," Eleanor replied with satisfaction. "Mrs. Henderson heard he took a position with a church in Colorado last month. Apparently, his congregation here became too difficult for his taste." Samuel chuckled. Amazing how difficult people can become when they start thinking for themselves. Eleanor picked up the brass school bell from the small table beside the door. It had been a wedding gift from the territorial governor himself, who had heard about their story and declared Millbrook an example of the finest qualities of frontier democracy. "Should I make a speech?" Eleanor asked, suddenly nervous about addressing so many people. "Just speak from your heart," Samuel advised. "It's never steered you wrong before." Eleanor stepped out onto the small porch and raised the bell high above her head. The crowd fell silent, even the children stopping their games to listen. "Friends and neighbors," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. 6 months ago, I stepped off a train in this town with nothing but a broken dream and a handful of books. I thought my story was ending, but instead, It was just beginning. She paused to look at the faces turned toward her, people who had become more than just employers or neighbors, but true friends who had fought for what they believed in. This schoolhouse represents more than just a place to learn reading and arithmetic, Eleanor continued. It represents the truth that knowledge belongs to everyone, regardless of their gender, their accent, or how much money their parents have. It represents the idea that a community grows stronger when its children grow smarter. Applause rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes as she saw the hope and determination on so many faces. But most importantly, she said, her voice growing stronger, this school represents what happens when good people refuse to let fear win. When they choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over judgment. Eleanor looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly, then back at the crowd. I was told I wasn't fit to teach because I was a woman. You proved them wrong. I was told this community didn't want change. You proved them wrong. I was told that one person couldn't make a difference. Together, we proved them wrong. She raised the bell again, her hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. So let this bell ring not just to open our school, but to announce to the world that Millbrook, Nebraska Territory, is a place where dreams come true when people have the courage to fight for them. Eleanor swung the bell with all her strength, and its clear, bright sound rang out across the prairie, echoing off the distant hills and seeming to promise that better days were coming for everyone who had the courage to reach for them. As the last notes of the bell faded into the summer air, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Children ran toward the schoolhouse to explore their new classroom. Parents shook hands and wiped away tears, and Samuel wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her close as they watched their community celebrate not just a new school, but a new way of thinking about what was possible. I love you, Eleanor Garrett, Samuel whispered in her ear. I love you too, Samuel, she whispered back, and I love what we've built together. As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor looked out at the endless prairie, stretching toward the horizon, and felt the same sense of infinite possibility that had brought her west in the first place. She had found her place in the world, at last, not as someone's shadow or society's expectation, but as herself, teacher, wife, and pioneer in the truest sense of the word. The promise of dawn had been fulfilled, and the future stretched before them bright with hope.